Good evening and welcome to our COVID-19 program update. I am Ladi Akiridoluale here, the highlights at this hour. Strict enforcement of COVID-19 protocols characterizes day one of opening of schools in Lagos. For other states, it's good for some, not so good for the others. Let's talk to Aaron Akpu Philip, who's a doctoral researcher at the School of Public Health and Social Work at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. He joins us via Skype. Good evening, Mr. Akpu Philip. Thank you for your time this evening.
Good evening, Ladi. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm sure you probably heard and you've probably seen some of the pictures and the reports out of Nigeria about schools reopening. First of all, let me ask you, what was it like? What's the situation with schools in Australia? And if they're open, how have they gone about this process?
Here in Australia, just like every other country that have been battling with the trade-off of opening economies, so that the economy does not suffer a lot. Here, a lot of schools went virtual. There were a lot of facilities deployed for students to still learn at home. But most of the schools have returned. In my own institution, there's a gradual face-to-face return for students and staff with all the guidelines from the WHO, physical distancing, use of hand sanitizers, and all of that. So at the moment, there's been resumption for students in all parts of Australia. But in states where we've seen spikes at the moment, there has been shutdown of some institutions at the moment.
Would you say there's a link between this issue of schools reopening and all the challenges that that brings and the spike that you just mentioned in some of the areas?
Yeah, obviously, as it is with reopening, as we have seen and noticed in some areas, some of the cases that have come up in Australia, for instance, in some areas in Australia, some of the cases have been highlighted to have come up from students or from staff from institutions who would have, for instance, gotten it at different points of contact or wherever they've gone. Although there were a lot of measures put in place to curtail this, but then there were still outbreaks, and those schools were shut down again. Students went back to online learning, and then the testing and cleaning of schools. So yes, to a very large extent, there's always that link with the outbreak in schools.
What do you think are the lessons, given the kind of examples that you have seen and witnessed in Australia out there? What are the kinds of lessons that you think that back home in Nigeria we can take from your experience to guard against some of the pitfalls that accompany this social experiment? Some have described it as that we're undertaking, this balance between health and resuming normal life.
Yes, so it is, there's a lot of lessons we can learn, but as it's known in Australia, and comparing Australia and Nigeria, it will be so ambitious to run a lot of comparisons in drawing some lessons, because these are context-specific measures, context-specific ideas in line with the funding they've got and all of that. Here in Australia, it was easy for most schools to open up and life to go back to normalcy for students who, as a matter of fact, did not lose out much, because there was daily virtual learnings and face-to-face interactions with their students while they were at home. But of course, as we will know, this is not entirely the case in Nigeria. So although we will want to learn, as we have learned over the past from most countries regarding lockdowns, regarding opening up economies, as we're seeing with trade-offs where people are gradually beginning to open. We've opened the economy now in Nigeria, we've opened up schools, but although some of the things that have happened in Australia, as we have seen, they've got some structures that work there. We will have to just adopt some of those structures locally. I have seen that the opening of schools, as some of the points highlighted by the presenters you had earlier, most of the schools have been opened, and most of the strategies that have been employed by some of these schools, as I've seen from your program today, is probably the same thing that has been employed by most institutions here, What I worry for, as has been highlighted by some of the presenters, is the implementation of this down the track. And I've seen that most of the schools that you've highlighted as well, they've got all of the structures in place and everything is going. But that is just one face to it, Laddie. We must also think about, the schools in rural areas. We have students in some rural areas, over 300 students attending a particular class. We have not highlighted some of these issues. And so imagine that some of these schools who are in rural areas, without the funding, without the structures, we will be able to borrow and leverage on some of the lessons from Australia or some other countries, as we've seen in terms of what is happening. But then what happens to our local structures in terms of implementation? Funding is a big thing. For instance, we've got students with disabilities in some of these schools. How are we also adjusting our structure to accommodate some of these things? Private schools, for instance, who majorly depend on funding from school fees or some other monies they get from students. These students have been home for a very long time, and now we've asked them to return back to school, which is good. Most of the schools are following the guidelines, the 52-page guideline that was put up by the federal government, which was beautifully written, and it captured all of the ideas and all of the things that most of the countries like Australia are already doing. So we already have this on paper. If you look at the 52-page guideline, which I saw some. But what is very, very important that we must do is to not just have these on paper, as it is saying. That was a worry highlighted by some of the presenters you had. Implementation is key. What happens to funding? The psychologist was very blunt in saying that go back with your cameras in the next few weeks and you see what is happening. That is just the worry, and that's a sad reality. Think of the public health implications of this is when we open up. We've just highlighted 2, 3, 4 schools. Like I said, there are 1,001 schools across the country. We have schools that have students over 300 students in a class. Who will be traveling from different parts of the world to attend classes or go back to school for exit examinations. But then what happens on the route to schools? What happens when they arrive? Looking at the data from NCDC, when I did some research, I saw that we had 6-to-1 labs across the country. It's a country of over 160 million people. And so I still think that, again, we will need to expand our testing capacity, not just in spotlight areas, but then a lot of people have highlighted issues on community testing, And if we have a country of over 160 million people, students are going back to school at the moment. What happens when there is an outbreak in a particular school? What is the facility that is in place to get the students for testing to avoid further spread as clusters? It is good to see that some schools are adopting the fact that everybody comes in school and stays in school. But again, what happens in terms of the funding to make that happen down the line? This is going to go
Mr.
on for a
Akpu,
few more weeks.
Philip, thank you so much for that. We've completely run out of time. I allowed that to go on because you were making quite a great deal of points that many of our administrators needed to hear. Thank you for your time. I'm sure we'll return to this subject at some time in the near future. Mr. Aaron Akpu Philip joined us from Brisbane in Australia.